So let's bring everything that we've been talking about together by looking at Oedipus, which Aristotle mentions in the Poetics, and introducing a few new concepts like fate and determinism. Now, when it comes to understanding stories, there's a matter of choice versus fate or determinism that's very, very important throughout all of storytelling. And most good stories hinge on the choice that characters make or the choices that they fail to make. And there may even be a kind of science to how this works in narrative. And so Aristotle refers to this great play, Oedipus Rex, as a way of exemplifying the problem of choice versus determinism, and we can pick up some very interesting narrative structures as well. And this is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. Now, there are many versions of Oedipus Rex, but the Sophocles version is recommended reading for a couple of reasons. First, its influence on theater and film remains enormous. And second, Oedipus Rex is a great example of the role of choice, and it taps into universal characteristics of the human experience that we all feel, that we all connect to. And third, you can view some very specific and interesting film adaptations. So for example, Pasolini made an excellent version of it. There's a really wonderful stage version starring William Shatner from his pre-Captain Kirk days. And there are also just so many references to Oedipus Rex throughout cinema. So Roman Polanski's Chinatown, for example, and of course Steven Spielberg's Minority Report, which we're going to be looking at in great detail. And I'm going to use it as a modern Oedipus as an example of how that this has been manifested so clearly in a contemporary picture. So you may want to make sure that you've seen Minority Report before we continue, and check out the Philip K. Dick short story as well. Now, for those of you who don't know Oedipus and don't have time to read the play or see a film version, it's the story from which we get the idea of the Oedipus complex. And this is a term Freud used to describe the aggression that children feel towards one of their parents while experiencing sexual desires for the other. So a young boy, for example, might wish to murder his father and sleep with his mother, and Carl Jung then went on to offer the alternative Electra complex to describe the competition a young girl might feel with her mother for the attention of her father. Kind of weird stuff, but I give you this background because it's interesting in a way. Now, Sigmund Freud and many people after him have thought deeply about this problem, which may or may not exist. I mean, many of the solutions to the problem, if it is a problem, have involved sitting on a couch for years and years and years to discuss your feelings in a psychotherapeutic session. But the reason why I want to get into this is because we have this chicken and the egg thing. What came first, genre or the individual example of genre? And in Peter Gay's biography of Freud, which I highly recommend reading, it's said that this isn't something that Freud came up with, but rather a patient mentioned to Freud that his life was like the Oedipus story. So the entrance of the Oedipus complex into psychological study and science and therapy comes from basically chance. Didn't have to have happened that way. And so it's very interesting that the Oedipus story is a lot about the role of chance, and it just happened to shape so much of what went on in the 20th century because of this introduction through Freud of the Oedipus story. So really interesting background. Now, as I hope to show, the value of knowing the Oedipus story in terms of genre goes far beyond the Freudian. And you don't even need to think about the Oedipus complex as Freud identified it or shaped its understanding in order to get a great deal out of understanding the Oedipus story in relation to knowledge. In terms of Aristotle, it's just so much more. So I want to give you a very loose summary of Oedipus Rex, and I hope that you'll go and read it. If you haven't read it already, I hope that this summary sells you on it. So in the story, a terrible curse has befallen Thebes. People are dying everywhere, and something must be done. Now, aware that something must be done, Oedipus sends his brother-in-law Creon to seek the advice of Apollo. And Creon informs Oedipus that the curse will be lifted if the murderer of Laius, who was the former king before Oedipus became the king, and someone who was murdered many years ago at a crossroads, is found and prosecuted. Now, despite some objections that he should just leave the matter alone, Oedipus dedicates himself to the discovery and prosecution of Laius's murderer, and Oedipus subjects a series of unwilling citizens to questioning, including a blind prophet named Tiresias. And Tiresias, who was a famous prophet of Apollo in Greek mythology and who lived in Thebes, informs Oedipus that Oedipus himself killed Laius. And this news bothers Oedipus, but his wife Jocasta tells him not to believe in the prophets because they've been wrong before. And as an example of their propensity for making false predictions, Jocasta tells Oedipus about how she and King Laius had a son who was prophesied to kill Laius and sleep with her. Now, because she and Laius had the child killed, she asserts that the prophecy could not be true, but Jocasta's story only deepens Oedipus's discomfort. As a child, an old man had told Oedipus that he was adopted and that he would eventually kill his biological father and sleep with his biological mother. And so now that this story is out of the bag, it's revealed that Oedipus once did kill a man at a crossroad intersection, and this sounds a lot like the way that Laius died. And Jocasta urges Oedipus to stop looking into his past any further, but he stubbornly ignores her, and he goes on to question a messenger and a shepherd, both of whom have information about how Oedipus was actually abandoned as an infant and adopted by a new family. And in this moment of insight, Jocasta realizes that she is Oedipus's mother and that Laius was his father. And horrified at what has happened, she kills herself. And shortly after that, Oedipus realizes that he had, in fact, murdered Laius and married his mother. And in horror and despair, he gouges his eyes out and he's exiled from Thebes. Now, as you can see, Oedipus Rex has this interesting narrative structure. The main events of the Oedipus narrative are already over before the play begins. The tragedy recounts what has already transpired by having us watch a detective, or a proto-detective, trying to figure out his past so he can decide what to do in the present to solve a very pressing problem. Now, one thing that's really interesting that you can look at in a book called A Thousand Plateaus is Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. They put this in a very interesting way. They say that this story combines finding out what happened and what will happen at the same time as being a very, very interesting way of thinking about the detective genre. And not all detective stories will do that, but bringing it together, what happened and discovering what will happen at the same time. The more closely that is brought together, the more interesting the story. And as we've seen, once Oedipus knows the truth, he prescribes and he enacts his own punishment by gouging out his eyes. And this is the moment of catharsis that Aristotle is talking about. So, if you'd like a writing exercise, read the play and see if you can identify other elements of fear and pity that we've talked about by devoting a paragraph or so to describing each, and you can submit that in the group. Now, in terms of narrative structure, the plot of Oedipus is not at all random. It has shape and it has form, and this form is also known as plot, and we can extract from the play some narrative structures that carry us through the story. So there's dilemma, there's crisis, there's decision and action, resolution, and we're going to go through these in order and talk about them in great detail so you can get a better understanding about how that they work in the next video.